So today's guest is Dr. Kate Ratliff. She's an associate professor at the University of Florida. She's also a mentor, maybe a friend. You don't have to chime in about that part. And she's going to talk to us a little bit today about her work as the executive director for 5 years at Project Implicit. So Kate, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking.
All right. So I like to start all of these out by just saying, generally, what are the research questions that most guide your work?
Yeah, so right now, the research questions that I'm most interested in have to do with how to educate people about bias, in particular, how to educate people about implicit bias in ways that are the most effective. So we're really looking at how do we teach people about bias in ways that keep defensiveness low so that people are responsive to the ideas, while simultaneously making people understand that they're accountable for the biases that they have. So kind of figuring out this balance between being non-threatening and reducing defensiveness, but also making people accountable.
I see. Okay, so we're going to get into that a little bit later on, but one reason that I wanted to talk to you is because you spent 5 years as the executive director at Project Implicit.
Yep.
It's hard to know the exact number of people who have individually completed an IIT. It's probably, even by the most conservative estimate on Project Implicit, it's something like 20 million. And most of those, I think, came under your watch as executive director. And so I want to ask you some questions about what you think about Project Implicit and the IIT more specifically. For anyone unfamiliar, I'm also a member of Project Implicit, so take these questions with the explicit and implicit biases that might be present there. But I guess when people, for example, in a class come and take an IIT on Project Implicit, what do you most hope that they get out of that experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I answer that, let me just say that I have been working on a chapter about Project Implicit, and the number is more like 32 million people have done an IIT. Okay. So yes, a lot.
Rounding error. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a couple of things. I mean, I certainly hope that they learn something about implicit bias. And, without getting into a bunch of scientific argument about what implicit bias is and what it means and how we measure it, what I really want people to understand is that, good people who are egalitarian and who really want to be fair-minded, have it within themselves, the biases of their society, and they have it within themselves to discriminate in ways that, they don't necessarily want to do. And so I really want people to just come away understanding that bias is all of our problem. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not, something out there in the air, but that it's something in us. And so, in terms of like specific content, that's really what I want people to know about implicit bias. But the other thing is, I think that one of the benefits of Project Implicit is that people also get to experience sort of science more generally, and psychological science. So, I also hope they get out of it some ideas about the work that scientists do and how we work and how things change over time. So there's kind of two pieces to that.
Okay. So, going back to that 30 million number, and this has been a very popular measure for over 25 years now, I would say, nearly 25 years, I would say. So anytime that many people take a test, there are going to be some criticisms of it. So anyone can Google IIT bad, and they're going to find some prominent articles about the IIT. Some of these are real substantive scientific disagreements. Some of these are more, I think, a misunderstanding about what researchers who are more vested in the IIT actually use it to measure. Yeah. So going on that latter side of things, there's one misconception that you could clear up about the IIT that you found to be the most popular among people who aren't experts on it. What is that misconception that you would most want to clear up?
Oh, that's really hard. There are a lot of them.
Okay, you can name a couple.
I think that one of them that is maybe not a misconception, because I think at some point scientists were responsible for pushing forward the idea that the IIT measures the unconscious, right? That it's some sort of window into attitudes and stereotypes that people don't know that they don't have introspective access to. And I think that idea has changed a lot in the last 20 years or so. And so, I don't use the phrase unconscious bias, especially when talking about measures like the IAT, because I think that the evidence is starting to come out that, people probably do have some sense of, the biases that give rise to their performance on these kinds of measures. Maybe they haven't thought about it a lot. Maybe they don't want to think about it a lot. Maybe they're not perfectly accurate. But I think it's pretty clear that measures like the IAT aren't tapping something that is, sort of deeply unconscious, some kind of true self.
Okay, I mean, that's well put. So it's not as if maybe when it first came out, the IAT was this window into this side of your psychology you had no idea about, and you were totally surprised by it. But it seems like over time that's kind of shifted into people might have some clue about how they would perform on these IAT measures. And there are studies where you ask people to predict how they would perform ahead of time on the IAT, and they're not entirely accurate, but they're more accurate than chance when you actually ask them to take it.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so the IAT is talked about a lot in terms of understanding wider discrimination or intergroup disparities. And I think the IAT has some role, but I want to ask the expert on that. Thinking more generally about intergroup disparities and discrimination, what role do you think the IAT has in that conversation?
Yeah, so this is something that I personally have kind of changed on a lot. And so, I want to be clear that I'm just sort of speaking for myself and not for Project Implicit, because I think, as an organization, there are a wide array of opinions on this particular topic. Honestly, I think that the role that the IAT has is really one of education. I think that people take the test, they have this experience of like, oh, why is it so much harder for me to put, women with career and men with family than it is to do the opposite? And so I think it can be a really powerful tool for that kind of education and self-awareness. I don't know how much the IAT predicts behavior. And I think that partly that's because that's not quite the right question. Like, does the IAT predict behavior? Well, I don't know when and for whom and for what attitude objects and under what circumstances. I think that the behavior question needs to have a lot more nuance than it currently does. Just the way 40 years ago, the question about whether explicit attitudes predict behavior required a lot more nuance than they originally started with. So that's one thing, is that I think we just don't quite know. The other thing on that is that I'm not sure it matters. I think that it's pretty clear that people internalize attitudes and stereotypes and that those impact their decision making. And I don't think we need the IAT to tell us that. I think that we can observe that even without the IAT, which is not to say it's not useful. I just think that even if it turned out that the IAT was just entirely bogus and it did nothing, which I don't think is the case, but if that turned out to be the case, that wouldn't mean that implicit bias isn't a thing, right? I think that we know that implicit bias is a thing. The question is, how does that relate to the IAT?
So can I get you to, a lot of students might be exposed to the IAT and the concept of implicit bias indiscriminately, interchangeably.
Yeah,
so can I get you to just say, when you're talking about implicit bias in this context, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so generally when I'm talking about implicit bias, I'm talking about sort of attitudes and stereotypes that are sort of spontaneous or automatic responses to stimuli. So when we're exposed to somebody from a different group, sort of what are the automatic responses to that? I still use associations. I think there's a lot of sort of controversy about what associations are and how they work. But I think that, implicit biases are the associations that we have between, traits or evaluations and stimuli, attitude objects, groups, people, ideas.
Okay.
And the IAT could be a measure of that, or not. And that wouldn't negate the fact that we have these associations and we have these biases.
Right, so there's associations that are activated automatically, but that's different from something you're entirely unaware of. You could be aware that you have them, but you can't necessarily stop yourself from activating them when you encounter certain social information out in the world.
Right.
Okay. I want to circle back into what you're saying earlier about your current research interests about defensiveness for the IAT. I don't know what the mean levels are for how people respond defensively, but I think a significant portion, sizable portion of people do respond defensively, especially when they get feedback on Project Implicit, suggesting that they might have associations that contradict with their explicit self-reported beliefs and behaviors. Yep. So first of all, what percentage of people do you think respond defensively? And if you can summarize your research, what do you think are some of the most effective strategies for cutting away that defensiveness?
Yeah, so the percentage question is a little bit hard, just because of the way that we typically do this research. The outcomes are generally kind of continuous measures. Without looking at any other factors, the scales at Project Implicit that people get after they finish an IAT and they get their feedback. There are items about, whether or not the IAT is scientific. So there's sort of one way of thinking about defensiveness that's sort of derogating the IAT. And then there are also items that are more like, I have bias, I am biased, that are sort of derogating the whole idea of implicit bias. And those items are on a 4-point scale. And usually people's responses are in the sort of 2.5-ish range, on kind of a defensiveness scale.
Yeah.
So I don't really have like a percentage,
Okay.
but we do know that there are a number of factors that are pretty predictable, that you might expect that predict defensiveness. So people are higher in defensiveness to the extent that their feedback contradicts what they self-report, as you said. People are more defensive to the extent that their feedback suggests that they implicitly prefer sort of culturally dominant groups over those that are, more marginalized groups. So those kind of factors. And then we're finding my grad student, Nicole Alfaro, is doing some work on sort of trait reactants. And, there are certain people who are just kind of more defensive in general. And they are also more defensive about their responses or their feedback on the IAT.
Okay, so have you found any strategy that you're particularly fond of for maybe cutting across this defensiveness?
We're working on that. So far, we haven't. So
Okay,
we've
I mean,
tried.
that's interesting in and of itself, yeah.
Yeah. So, one thing that I think we would think matters is framing implicit bias as sort of a cultural phenomenon versus a personal phenomenon.
Mm.
And that doesn't seem to make much of a difference. People are still fairly defensive, even when you talk about implicit bias in general, or talk about other people's IAT scores instead of just your own performance. So that's one thing we've tried that doesn't really seem to cut defensiveness. So we're still working on it. And the thing that's interesting is some people aren't defensive, right? Some people have more of a guilt kind of response. And those people seem very willing to change their behavior in ways that the defensive people don't. So it's definitely an important problem to figure out.
Okay, you'll come back and you'll tell us how you solved it soon. While wrapping up here, I like to ask a couple kind of questions of everyone. So within this research, within your line of research about the IAT, but maybe not your line of research, but within the use of the IAT, is there a particular direction that the IAT is being used nowadays that you find particularly exciting or interesting?
Yeah, so I'm really, really interested in, the work that Keith Payne and others are doing. I know there are people at your university doing this kind of work, looking at implicit bias sort of on a big scale, like geolocating bias. And I'm really, really interested in that work, partly because it's just cool, right? There's some really interesting findings, but I also think it's really important for helping us understand implicit bias as sort of an individual phenomenon versus a cultural phenomenon, and sort of how much it reflects people versus situations. So I've been really interested in that work, and I'm really glad that people are finding that use from the Project Implicit data sets.
Right, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'll brag about us if you're not going to. I think that work is very novel, and it's done by some really insightful people, but it's also facilitated by all the data, 32 millions of rows of data that we've put up for anyone to use. So anyone listening to this can go explore those data sets as well.
And Jordan particularly is responsible for that, so thank you.
So zooming out even further, so aside from the IAT, but just thinking more generally about the field of intergroup relations, is there a particular topic or issue that you really hope the field makes a lot of progress on in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so, one of the things that I think and lots of people have been sort of, maybe not struggling with, but really thinking about is kind of where these sorts, we'll just use sort of a general category of subtle biases, implicit biases, subtle biases, kind of where they fit in to kind of the broader the broader picture of, you know, if we think about systemic racism and sort of structural racism, and then we think about these sort of subtle kinds of biases, like how does that all fit together, right? Like what is the role of individual level implicit bias in the face of what seems like so much structural bias? And sort of what is the benefit of thinking about these problems from one perspective versus the other, and kind of how do they fit together? I've been really thinking a lot about that, and I think and hope that other people have too.
I mean, that's very well put. I think we talk about this a little bit in class. You know, you have to keep in mind about where the individual is situated within the group and where the group is situated within larger societal structures. At the end of the day, all these are operating by individual minds, you know, so
Right.
you know, what's the role of just, in psychology, we focus so much on the individual mind, and there's a lot of work to be done there, but there's also these larger structures that we need to pay attention to as well. And there's finding that right balance is going to be a really interesting question in the years to come.
Yeah, certainly.
So thank you so much for your time, Kate, and for telling us a little bit more about Project Implicit and about your own work. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.